Perfect. Right, sorry everyone that we didn't get to put this up as a live event as planned. We had some technical difficulties. I'm sure we're all used to it in the lovely world of Zoom that we now live in. So yeah, we are going ahead with this. We're going to record the session and we will be putting this up on Facebook for you to view. So hello and welcome to our hustings for the Police Crime Commissioner candidates. This event is being run by Aberystwyth Student Union and is your opportunity to ask your candidates anything about the election. My name is Nate and I'm the President of the Students' Union. I'm pleased to present all our candidates for today who will be focusing on issues for students and young people in the local area. Please note all candidates standing were sent an invite to the event and given equal opportunity to attend. Some students have pre-submitted questions for our candidate, which we will go through first. My next bit of my speech was going to be to say put something in the comments, but obviously you can't do that now. So if you do want to put something in the comments, we can email that to our candidates at a later date. Each candidate will have equal opportunity to answer all questions. With this in mind, we ask that submitted questions are generic to all candidates. If they are targeted at specific parties, you may find we have to adapt your question.
Nosweddau chi a chroeso cynnes i'r Hustings ar gyfer ymgeiswyr i Comisiynydd Throseddu ar Heddlu. Mae'r digwyddiad hwn yn cael ei rhedeg gan yr undeb myfyrwyr yn Aberystwyth a dyma'ch cyfle i chi ofyn unrhyw beth i'r ymgeiswyr am yr etholiad. Fenw yw moc llywydd undeb myfyrwyr Cymraeg Aberystwyth a glywch chi wrth net jyst nawr sef llywydd yr undeb ehangach. Rwy'n falch o gyflwyno ein holl ymgeiswyr heddiw a fydd yn canolbwyntio ar faterion i fyfyrwyr a phobl ifanc yn yr ardal leol. Hoffwn nodi'n gyntaf gafodd bob ymgeisydd gwahoddiad i'r digwyddiad yma. Mae rhai myfyrwyr wedi cyflwyno cwestiynau o flaen llaw ar gyfer ein hymgeiswyr, felly byddwn yn mynd trwy'r rheini yn gyntaf. A fel wedodd Nate, bydden ni'n agor y llawr wedyn i myfyrwyr i comentio ar y live, os bydden ni wedi llwyddo i fynd live, ond wrth gwrs nath hynny ddim ddigwydd. So os chi'n moyn e-bostio eich cwestiynau yn benodol i'r ymgeiswyr, bydd hwnna'n bosib i chi wneud ni. Bydd bob ymgeisydd yn cael cyfle i ateb bob cwestiwn, a gyda hyn mewn golwg gofynnwn bod cwestiynau a gyflwynir yn rhai generic ac yn agored i bob ymgeisydd i ateb. Os maen nhw wedi cael eu targedu at bartion penodol, efallai bydd rhaid i ni addasu'ch cwestiynau. Diolch.
Brilliant, thank you very much, Mark. So a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Questions will be asked to all candidates in English. If they wish to reply in Welsh, they have agreed to summarise it in English afterwards. We'll also be monitoring the comment section of the video throughout and request that all comments remain respectful of all candidates and parties. I will ask candidates the same question and ensure everyone has equal time to answer. If a candidate wants to speak, then I have asked them to raise their hand in the chat section and I will come over to them next. So now we're going to go over to who our candidates are. So we have with us David Llewellyn from Plaid, we have John Burns from Conservatives, Philippa Thompson from Labour and Glyn Preston from the Liberal Democrats. So how I will start this is I'll go over to each candidate and they will each have 5 minutes to talk about themselves and why you should vote for them. After that, I will go to our pre-submitted questions and I will make sure that everyone has equal time to answer each question. So I'm going to start with you, David, if you would like to go first and tell students why they should vote for you.
Thank you, Nate. Just i ddechrau, hoffwn I ddiolch i'r undeb am dangos diddordeb yn etholiad y Comisiynydd Heddlu. Diolch yn fawr iawn I chi am gynnal y session. So thank you in the first instance to the Students' Union for showing an interest in the Police and Crime Commission elections. It's really important for us to highlight and increase the public's understanding. You may or may not be aware, for example, that we don't get an electoral address as Police and Crime Commissioners, so we don't actually get the paid literature that has been like a torrent through people's doors in the last few weeks for the Senedd elections. So hopefully this event will support us as candidates. There are 4 candidates standing in presenting ourselves. So who is David Llewellyn? I'm an individual that grew up and I've lived in the Dyma Police Force area for the majority of my life. I'm married with 5 children living in South Ceredigion in Llandysul. Why should students vote for me? Well, one of the reasons might be that one of my children is currently a student. So I know the trials and tribulations that students are going through at the moment. It's been a really difficult time for everybody. He's in Cardiff University, and I've got a daughter who's 18 as well, and a few younger ones. My background is that I've worked within policing for 20 years. I was a statistician for Dyfed Powys Police in the first instance, and then went to work in CID as a principal crime and intelligence analyst, working on major investigations and working alongside officers in the presentation of data for court. Worked on conspiracy operations in terms of supply of drugs, murder investigations and protracted inquiries. So it gave me a real insight into how policing works. And during that period, I used to also complete the strategic assessment for the force. So I like to think that I got a wider understanding of the strategic pressures that influence policing, especially in the Dyfed Powys area. In 2014, I left the force and I went to work at Aberystwyth University. So I'm very familiar with the university in Aberystwyth. I worked in the Law and Criminology department as a teaching fellow in criminology and had a fantastic time. It's a period in my career that I really look back with huge fond memories. And there were some very influential individuals in the department at the time, Professor John Williams and Alan Clark, that really steered me towards having the confidence to stand election, because it isn't a small decision in life for you to go for election for public office. And I took the bold decision in 2016 to stand, and obviously for the last 5 years I've been the Police and Crime Commissioner. It should have been a 4-year term in office, but we've had this very traumatic year as a country, as a globe, worldwide, with the pandemic. And as a result of that, the election last year was cancelled for a year. So that gave me an extra year in office. But this term will be now curtailed to 3 years. So I've been the commissioner for the last 5 years, and during that time, I've managed to increase the police officer numbers. We've got more police staff numbers compared to when I started. I've reinvested in CCTV to try and make our town centres more safe and secure for individuals, and some of your members might recall there was a very nasty incident in Aberystwyth, for example, about 3 years ago that affected a student, life-changing injuries, and the CCTV would have been invaluable in that investigation for officers. So that is now in place. 25 towns with over 150 cameras monitored live from police headquarters. I've set up a rural crime team. We've also got a youth forum and also a victims forum to try and ensure that the policing service, and this is really important, this is at the heart of what I try and describe as myself as being a bridge between a community and a police service. It is important for young people, it is important for victims, but also important for the wider community, which is why I've held public meetings alongside chief officers to have a really strong say in your policing service. And I commit to continue that work if re-elected, and we'll seek to ultimately ensure that the Dyfed Powys Police Service remains and retains the standards that we provide on a day-to-day basis. Diolch yn fawr, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much, David. Now we'll move over to Philippa.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm standing as the Labour and Cooperative candidate for Police and Crime Commissioner for Dyfed Powys, and I returned here to my home in Pembrokeshire, where I'm speaking from to you today, after my last overseas posting with the Foreign Office. So I joined the diplomatic service at the age of 18 with A-levels in French, German and Russian, and 4 of us joined at that time with A-levels, but most people joined with a degree, and nowadays the main entry route for the work that I did would be at degree level. And these days the Foreign Office, which is now the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, prefers candidates to have outside experience first as well. So I was seconded to the French Civil Service Training School, ENA, and I carried on learning by taking diplomatic service language training and exams throughout my 30-year career. So I have a particular interest in security policy to do with conflict and resolution in an international context, but particularly from a human rights perspective. And I've worked and negotiated for the UK position with multilateral institutions like the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the European Union, the United Nations and the Council of Europe. And my last overseas posting was as Deputy High Commissioner to the Seychelles, which was a pretty fantastic job. And my last roles at the Foreign Office in London were dealing with the Council of Europe, which you may know is based in Strasbourg. And then I worked on equality and non-discrimination issues in the Human Rights Department. So I'm really proud that we were one of the countries to design the European Convention on Human Rights. And that was a result of the atrocities seen in the Second World War. And it was actually a conservative politician who was one of the leaders in drawing up the convention because of his experience at the Nuremberg trials. And most recently, it was the Labour government who introduced the Human Rights Act here. And one of the advantages of that is that British people have less need to take their cases to Strasbourg because they can be considered in our courts. And you'll probably know there's huge division in our country at the moment on many things. And that really saddens me. Every time we talk about the other and their rights, in fact, the rights we actually have to lose are those that all of us enjoy. So protecting our rights, it just matters for everybody, not just for other people. So why should you vote for me? I think it depends very much on what your political views are. And from a Labour perspective, what we are offering as police and crime commissioners, we have 2 Labour and cooperative police and crime commissioners in Wales at the moment. And it's taking a public health approach to tackling crime and crime prevention, which means working across organisations, the police working with local government, working with the Welsh Labour government at the moment in Cardiff, and with voluntary organisations. And I've got a great deal of experience in working across government departments and also working with consular work, looking after British people facing problems overseas, for example. So what I'm offering to everyone is to listen, to be your voice, and to make the work of the police responsive to your needs. And I have experience of standing up for the United Kingdom, and I will stand up for you. This includes standing up for the police as well, because the police are just as much part of our community as the rest of us are. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Philippa. I will now move over to Glyn. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Noswaith dda, good evening. My name is Glyn Preston. I'm your Welsh Liberal Democrat candidate for the Dyma Powys Police Region to become your Police and Crime Commissioner. And I would like to say, rather cheekily, that I hope you vote Welsh Liberal Democrat on all your ballots on May the 6th, and not just for me, if you want to put recovery first. Just a little bit about me then. I'm 21 years old. I was born and brought up in Montgomeryshire in the Dyma Powys region. A sibling of mine and my father went to university in Aberystwyth, in fact, and I spent many happy summer holidays in Pembrokeshire, so I feel as though I know the area pretty well. Yeah, as I was saying, I've lived in Montgomeryshire all my life, but other than the past 3 years where I've been spending my time on and off while studying at university. So I'm soon to become a political science graduate. So a little bit about why I want to be your Police and Crime Commissioner. I think I've got 3 key reasons that I want to stand. And that's because, first of all, I want to put a strong focus on community policing and a community policing approach. Second of all, I'd favour shifting police resources away from criminalising individual drug users in favour of tackling, the big fish. That's the scourge of county lines drug dealing. And that again is about taking a public health approach to tackling crime. And last of all, if you are a bit confused about why we have these roles, these police and crime commissioner roles, and not quite understanding why we have politicians making decisions about police forces without actual adequate powers, then you should vote to me to abolish these police and crime commissioner roles. These roles were created without public consent by a Conservative government, and the Welsh Liberal Democrats would be in favour of devolving justice to Wales and to the Senedd, because we believe that decisions about justice are better taken by politicians in Wales, but that we need to put power back in the hands of local police forces as well. So just to round off, thank you so much for the Students' Union for inviting me to speak to you tonight, and I'm really looking forward to having the debate with the other candidates. Thanks very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Glyn. And last but not least, Jonathan.
Good evening, Nate. And I'd just very quickly like to echo David's sentiments at the beginning. Thank you for inviting us all on. It's an election that has already been said is not one where we get the benefit of a direct mail free post through the front door, and that does hamper all candidates equally on the call. So occasions such as this are really valuable for the process of an engagement, which I think is something we can all agree on. A few words about myself. I was born in Manchester, and we moved down to the south coast of England when I was a child. I've worked, went to university in Brunel in West London. Straight out of university, went to work for the Home Office, and I was working in the Inspectorate of Prisons, right opposite the corridor from the Inspector of Constabulary, which is probably a dirty word for the incumbent commissioner. We didn't talk to them much. But the Inspectorate of Prisons, it was something that was quite formative for me, and I spent about 2 years there, and that I found particularly formative in the sense of changing my view of what the role of prisons is, and what the role of the judicial system is, and its role in how it treats prisoners, and indeed what its role is to protect victims as well. Specifically, the idea that prison, whilst a very popular sentiment to bang them up and throw away the key in inverted commas, isn't usually the best thing for society. In fact, it's usually far more sensible to try and rehabilitate in almost 99% of cases. And those establishments that were working hard to rehabilitate criminals usually found a far lesser what we call recidivism rate, a reoffending rate, which is obviously a good thing for not just the public, the police, the courts, and in turn the prison service. So that was something that I found particularly interesting, spent an awful lot of time working on, and was a particular bugbear, a particular area of interest of mine. After the working for the Home Office, I moved to what you would call public affairs. I worked with a number of charities and commercial organisations, largely in the pharmaceutical area. One or two famous names that we see today involved in vaccine rollouts, not in the same sort of medical areas, but it was a bit of a step change in industry for me. It's still a very fascinating one, involving things such as medical devices, replacement joints, that sort of thing, and some rather clever medicines. And that role took me to Wales right at the turn of the millennium, where I moved to Cardiff, and I spent 15 very happy years working in Cardiff, not least on Cardiff County Council. I was elected, I'm lucky enough, fortunate enough to be elected for 2 terms on Cardiff Council. That had an awful lot, as anyone on the call who's had experience of being a councillor will tell you, that it's very hard to condense the work that you would do in 8 years. But I cherry pick a few highlights. One in particular was involvement in setting up 2 Neighbourhood Watch charities, and Neighbourhood Watch organisations, I should say. They weren't really charities, but that involved extremely close work with the local police, and we had a fantastic local working relationship with South Wales Police next door to David Paris, and we had an awful lot of great successes, and made what I would call a somewhat challenging and difficult estate into somewhere that had some very encouraging crime trends going downwards, I'm pleased to say, from a lot of collaborative work. And it was something that, again, I would pick out as a particular area of enjoyment in my 8 years there. Since then, I worked back across the border over in Gloucestershire, and not being able to stay away from Wales, I'm now back again to involve myself in the Police and Crime Commission elections, which has always, as I just said to you, been an area of interest for me. Not always been totally sold on the idea. There's somewhat of a skeptic when they were first brought in by the coalition government, Conservative and Lib Dem, as I recall. But it is something that I believe can be a force for good. I believe that this election is actually somewhat different to most elections that will certainly be going on at the moment, but also I think what you'll notice from this call, those watching, is that this is likely to be something less of a politically adversarial conversation than one would normally have in a general election format, because I suspect those on the call are united in a commitment to help the police succeed, help the public engage with the police in a constructive manner. I'm just being told I've got 30 seconds left, so I'll shut up now. But that's me in a nutshell. Thank you for the opportunity, Nate.
Brilliant, thank you, Jonathan. You did get closer to that 5 minutes than the other candidates. Thank you very much. That is our candidates. Really nice to hear about you and your backgrounds. Very different. Really nice to hear what you're standing for as well. So now I will move over to some of our questions that have been submitted by some students. So our very first question is submitted by a student called Mark, who has said, do you believe that the privatizing and outsourcing of the justice system is a waste of resources and is ineffective, etc., G4S and Serco? If so, why? To start with this, I think I will go over to Philippa, if that's okay.
Well, thank you for your question, Mark. I think that public services, and that includes the justice system, should be delivered by the government, and that there shouldn't be profits made from it, because if money were made, it should be ploughed back into the system and not paid out in profits to companies. So I think that the probation service is perhaps one example, that's come back in-house here in Wales. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that then everything joins up better as well across the justice system. So I would certainly want to see government controlling our justice system. And when I say government, there's obviously a division between the executive, the government, and the courts. So I wouldn't want to see any changes to that, of course. So when I talk about government, it's really to do with government finance, paying for those systems to work properly. And of course, government finance is our money. So I don't think that our money should be spent on giving profits to outsiders in that way. I hope that answers your question.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philippa. Jonathan, would you like to answer that?
Sorry, just looking for my mute button. Thank you, Nate, and thank you, Mark, for that question. Perhaps a slightly surprising answer from a Tory, in inverted commas, but I've seen firsthand, particularly from the time at the Home Office, but a lot of us have subsequently, the horror stories from G4S, Serco, and Sodexo, the other major supplier. I think, ideologically speaking, there are certain areas such as prisoner transport that we use Serco and G4S specifically for, where there are sensible arguments for allowing them to use it. The problem, I think, as I say, from personal experience, and I suspect the commissioner will be able to, the incumbent commissioner will be able to add to this, but my experience has been that you have very, very large organizations who build their entire business model around fleecing the taxpayer, and they become extremely inefficient, extremely good at extracting cash from the taxpayer, and about value for money is pretty much the last on their list. So I think I would argue there, in answer to Mark's question, that it very much comes down to a sensible tendering process. I think as long as the people who are striking a sound deal with an external organization are doing it with the very best interests of the taxpayer, with a business head on, then it is in principle a good idea. Clearly, I would agree with Philippa on that point, that there was no suggestion whatsoever that a court or a statutory body like the police or the Justice Department or any of that should in any way be privatised. That is very much state apparatus and should always remain thus. This is about certain areas of allowing private enterprise to assist that may potentially be more efficient than the state doing it.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Glyn?
Well, I think the Welsh Liberal Democrats would always favour an evidence-based approach rather than one which is driven by ideological conviction. And I think the situation regarding G4S and their management of the probation service clearly shows a system that is not working. And I'm pretty sure, although people can fact check me afterwards, that this is another one of failing Grayling's failures, in fact. And when Jonathan talks about the tendering process, failing Grayling got it wrong again when it came to rail franchises as well. So I was totally ridiculous that he managed to stay in a job that long. My answer to the question, though, is that clearly the evidence has shown that it was not sensible to allow G4S, amongst other companies, to run our probation service or what have you, and we should take them back into public hands because we get better value for the taxpayer. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glenn. And last but not least, David.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, thank you to Mark for the question. So I'll start really with my promise. So my promise to anyone electing David Llewellyn as the Police and Crime Commissioner, I will not seek to privatise any core police support functions within, and we've seen that at play. So for example, in Lincolnshire, one of the forces, they actually privatised their command and control centre. So the call centre to the police was actually privatised and caused a whole host of difficulties for the police service. And again, it was in that era of Grayling, as Glyn highlighted. And the probation service, I think, is a really good example. It's a classic example where all the other parties were calling for this not to happen. It happened under a particular government, and it became, sadly, the mess that we now are having to mop up here in Wales. And what's happened, just to explain some of the detail in relation to that, by bringing private companies in, there are a couple of things that happen from an ideological point of view. You fragment the service from one point of view. Linked to that, there is an accountability issue that goes away. So the governance of that activity, you could argue, moves from being a traditional governance structure to one of contractual management with a private company, which at the heart of it will always have profit and pound signs as its key deliverable and key outcome. And as a result of that activity, for me, what we've seen, and John alluded to this, we've seen in the Dyfed Powys Police Force area in particular, the economies of scale do not exist for it to be an attractive and a lucrative business model for some of the private companies, because what then plays out is, as opposed to having equity of access to services, very similar to the banking model that we've seen, where we have a retraction out of our rural communities and our market towns of banks and institutions, we see the polarization and closure of some of that activity within our communities. As a result, offices might close, let's say in Aberystwyth, because they will have a hub in Carmarthen. And I've on a personal level tried to fight against that. So we try to fight against closure of police stations, for example, because they are community assets. And the same is true for all of the different agencies that are at play within the wider criminal justice system. So a couple of things there from me. The promise that I'm not going to privatise any of the core functions, which means a lot actually to the staff associations in Dyfed Powys and people that are employed by Dyfed Powys Police, but bearing in mind there are 2,000 employees that work for the force. So that promise is a commitment. And further than that, it's to work now on the rebuilding of the probation service, seeking to build a partnership approach to the commissioning of services, working with the 4 police commissioners across Wales and the probation service through the Criminal Justice Board in Wales, which has really developed to being quite a strength of force within Wales now, although it doesn't sit on any statutory footings, and that probably comes into the devolution question that Glyn mentioned earlier, but it doesn't currently sit on any statutory footings, but allows us to build that partnership approach in the public sector as opposed to the private sector. Diolch.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to all the candidates for your answers to that question. Some very interesting answers there. So we'll now move on to our next question, which is from a student called Emily, which is, what will you do about alleged institutional racism in the police service, and what action will you take to tackle it? And I think for this one, we'll start with you, Jonathan, if that's okay.
Sorry, I keep my mouse over the mute button there. Well, I mean, the immediate knee-jerk answer is zero tolerance. That's the first two words that come to my mind. I'm realistic that whilst I think it is a very fair suggestion that we do not share anything like the problems that our friends across the Atlantic do, we do still have pockets in in certain public service areas that perhaps are not as enlightened as the rest of us would like them to be. I would struggle to move on from the concept of zero tolerance were it ever to be witnessed by myself as a potential future commissioner, whether it in the OPCC, the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, or in the force itself. It is without question grounds for immediate sanctions and action, starting with the removal of that individual. End of discussion. In terms of follow-up and dealing with somebody who was found to be guilty of such behaviour, I would want to explore the full extent of the law to prosecute them potentially under the hate crime legislation. Quite frankly, I think that is as strict, that is as severe as we have to be. We don't, I genuinely believe, have that problem endemically in this country anymore. But I do think that that sort of hardline approach is absolutely necessary to make it very clear to any tiny microcosm of individuals who think it's appropriate.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. We'll move over to David now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you, Nate, and thank you for the question. Very, very timely question with the year that we've gone through with the George Floyd incident, obviously sparking off the Black Lives Matters movement. Again, not just in the US, but in the UK, and we've seen within the Dyma Powys Police Force area in Aberystwyth in particular, some peaceful protests highlighting some of the concerns. And the first thing to do is to accept that when you look at the outcomes and the data that is at play, whether it be stop and search data, whether it be the population of prison service, there does seem to be a disproportionate representation of the Black minority ethnic population in those institutions, and we need to grapple with it. So you need to accept that there is an issue to deal with as the questioned in relation to institutional racism. I completely agree with John's immediate response to individual racist acts by employees or staff, and I think there is continually an internal activity that needs to play into all of this, which is to improve our unconscious bias and our understanding of unconscious bias that is at play throughout our communities. And until we A, acknowledge it, and B, then seek to invest in the steps to try and improve that situation, that's the only way that it can be addressed. We've already undertaken some unconscious bias training in Dyma Powys as an agency within our staff and police officers, but I think we need to escalate that. So one example is to try and improve the representation of the Black minority ethnic population in the staff themselves. So we've done a lot of work with academic institutions actually to try and attract the best talent from the universities, from the BAME community. And it's fantastic that we've actually got an increase in our recruitment of that population going forward. But we also need them represented in some of our groups, for example, the independent groups that provide us with advice and guidance in force. So I've got a quality assurance panel, for example. That quality assurance panel currently doesn't have any BAME representation. That's not reflective of our population. So I need to address that. That's just one example. The youth forum, for example, we need to increase the BAME community in the youth forum and all of those forums, but you need to do it proactively is the point I'm making. So thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And now we'll move over to Glyn.
I think I'd agree with a huge amount of what's already been said, and I think that might be a theme on this question. I would like to thank David for what he said about compulsory unconscious bias training within the police service, and that kind of training has got to be continual, has it not? The Welsh Liberal Democrats have committed to publishing a strategy on tackling race inequality in our criminal justice system. And I mean, this is also about police practices too. It's about things like stop and search, which, as David has already outlined, disproportionately affects those from a Black or minority ethnic background. And I think my final point would be, David also mentioned about peaceful protests that went on protesting institutional racism in our country. And I do think our country, the UK, is institutionally racist. And I would like to say that I would personally fight any Tory attempt, like the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, to curb our right to protest freely, for it is one of the most precious rights that we have. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glenn. And last but not least, Philippa.
Well, thank you for your question, Emily. I was so pleased actually to hear David's answer, because that's just what I would want to be seeing. And clearly it's something that if he's elected again, he'll make sure that there's more training. Unconscious bias training was mentioned, for example, going forward. And that's certainly something I would want to see. And I would also want to look at the facts and figures on this. I would want to know that people are able to come forward and say that this is happening and that it can be documented and tackled. And not so much in the police, but in the community as a whole, it's something that really worries me. My own children have suffered from racism themselves, and one of my sons at university in England, I was talking to him about had he experienced racism, and yes, he has. And a lot of people from a mixed race background, but I think a lot of people from the BAME community, they experience this, and there's too much of it, and we, the rest of us, don't hear a lot about it. It happens so frequently in their lives that it's incredibly worrying and concerning that the other members of the community should behave in this way to people that we live and work with and are in our own families. So I think that training in the police is certainly one way forward, but I would like to see far more done about education in schools and education of the wider community as well. We've simply just got to realise that everybody is equal no matter what, and that's just an incredibly important and precious thing.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Some brilliant answers from all the candidates there. I know the students will be really happy to know that it's being taken seriously by you all. So now I think we'll move on to our next question of the evening. So this is submitted by Sam. He says, to what extent is it our responsibility rather than the police's to keep us safe out and about at night? And to start this one, we'll go over to Glyn first.
Unfortunately, crime exists, but I think too often on these issues, people seek to blame the victim rather than the circumstances in which that have led to that crime. And that can be the role of the police, but let's face it, the police can't do everything. This is also about poverty, cuts to our public services, you know, the fact that buses don't run late enough so that people have to walk home rather than they can't get a bus. And so I would never seek to engage in any kind of victim blaming. Having been a victim of crime myself, I know how awful it feels. Yeah, I think that's all I've got to say on the matter, really. I just think that I would approach issues very carefully and never seek to blame victims of crime for what has happened to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Glyn. And now to Philippa.
I think that's a really good question, and I think it depends in so many ways on what the context is. And I'm just wondering, in a town centre, for example, students going out, young people going out, having a great time in the evening and being out really late. And I think that's David mentioned about more CCTV and that it's being monitored 24 hours in police headquarters. So that's a sort of police role in trying to keep our town centre secure. And I also know that there's street pastors in some areas will go out and sort of walk around trying to help people who might be a little under the influence, should I say, later on. So, and it's looking out for each other. So I think there's a role for the police, but there's a role for the community as well. And look out for each other. And Lynn's right to point out about there needs more investment in, say, public transport, particularly in our rural areas, so that people can get safely around. Perhaps in things, of course, like street lighting as well. I know that I would be extremely nervous walking along a dark street at night, no matter where I was. So it's all sorts of things like that. But if you've got ideas and thoughts as to how this could work, then please let me know where I elected, but let any of us know, because I'm sure that we would want to hear them and take that forward.
Thank you very much for your answer there. Now I'll go over to Jonathan.
Thanks again, Nate. And it was Emily, the questioner. Is that, am I right?
Sam, this one.
Sam, apologies, Sam. There's, again, I think this is a bit of a prophecy I made at the beginning, that there are certain elements to this this role that are very unlikely to generate a huge amount of disagreement between right-thinking human beings. First thing to say that in addition to what has already been said is that the deeply tragic case of Sarah Everard recently in an area of London I used to live in, actually literally just down the road, brought home quite horrifically what the the problems that I think in fairness a lot of men don't fully appreciate. I would hold my hand up to that, that it is having talked it extensively with my wife at the time we were discussing it, and it is something that needs to be better understood across the gender divide. There is certainly a common sense approach here that people do of any background, male, female, whoever, need to be careful of their public safety. Obviously, there are certain circumstances that we should always be very careful of, be they being out and about, being our own personal safety, our home security, anything like that. You know, any kind of crime prevention measures are sensible in that regard. But at the same time, we must all be striving for a country where something like that can never happen. Unfortunately, the area of perfection, police have to be successful every single time stopping it happening. Somebody like the perpetrator only needs to be successful once. So it is something that unfortunately you will always get these one-off instances. But a 50-50 split down the middle there. I would agree with Sam that there is an element where people do need to be very conscious of their own public safety and where they are and what time they are working, as has already been discussed. Issues such as later running public transport, especially in more the urban areas, being able to call on help if you are in a isolated area, particularly, as I say again, more in the urban areas more than the rural ones. If you are you're traveling alone, you're probably more likely to be in a car in more rural locations. But I would say that CCTV, as has already been referenced, is something that could help improve the detection of this sort of thing if it, God forbid, were ever to happen again in our locality. I'm being told 30 seconds left, so I'll stop rabbiting. Philippa mentioned something there.
Thank you, Jonathan. Philippa, if you want to jump in there, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I just wondered if I could ask a question of the student union. Do you have a sort of like a little coaches or walking buses or anything like that to help people move around late at night?
It's actually something that we've started to look at recently since our Reclaim These Streets vigil that we did for Sarah Everard. It's something that a few staff members here are feeling really passionate about, and a few of our volunteer officers as well. And they're feeling really passionate about it, and it's something that they are definitely looking into at the minute. So yeah, thank you for asking that, Philippa. And we'll go over to David then to answer that last question.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, thank you to Sam for the question. It isn't an easy one to answer, I think, in a very one-dimensional, straightforward way. So there are a couple of things I would say on a personal level. I want to ensure that everybody can live a life which is, safe and free from harm. That is what we want. We want people, irrespective of the location, irrespective of you as an individual and any personal traits that you have, that you can just live your life safe and free. That's what I'm striving for. So we talked about some of the practical things that have been put in place. So CCTV is going to provide a sort of a situational crime prevention activity in terms of, making some of our town centres safer. But it's not just the answer. I think it's a wider societal responsibility that we have. So we need to ensure that there's key partner agencies that are engaged. We talked earlier about, Philippa mentioned the street pastors, which do a fantastic job out across many of the towns of the Dyfed-Powys area. I've actually had the privilege of going out with them of an evening. But in addition to that, the licensing departments need to be robust in terms of, working with licensees in relation to the responsibility that they have. So the responsibilities that licensees and other individuals within the community have. And linked to that as well is some education. So education in relation to how you should behave, so that, that people understand that you have to take personal responsibility for the actions that you undertake, even when going out on a night out and having a few drinks, like many of us have and do enjoy. What I would like to perhaps deliver in the next term of office, if I was to be re-elected, we've reinvested in the neighbourhood policing teams, for example, and we've got a problem-solving sort of approach to that work that they're undertaking. We're also rolling out town centre police constable as part of that to engage with businesses and licensees so that they've got a police constable face to that neighbourhood policing activity. I would like to work with the likes of the union in Aberystwyth and other key stakeholders to identify safe spaces within our towns as well, so that there is an understanding, and then to share that with people so that again is promulgated out to the wider community, and again that we're taking that shared ownership of it. So I would 100% support Glyn's comment about we should never ever blame the victim for any incident that occurs, but we should also take a learning from it from a societal point of view as to how we collectively can make the situation better for the future.
Thank you very much, David. Some really interesting answers there. The students will be happy to hear them. So we'll now move on to our next question of the evening. So this is from Jess, and she says, what plans do you have to help moderate the reopening of pubs and clubs, especially with the return of students in September? And to start this, we will go over to David, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. So there are already plans in place. So just to share some of the experiences of Dyfed-Powys over the last 12 months. The last summer months that we had, last year, August was the busiest year that we've ever experienced. So the number of calls for service, the number of incidents was much higher than we've ever experienced. And a lot of that is to do with the fact that obviously people aren't traveling abroad, that they are now coming into the Dyfed-Powys area. Why wouldn't you? It's such a lovely area to come and visit and enjoy during the summer months. But with that, there comes tensions in the community in terms of public order, alcohol-related violence, and on all the associated problems. So I know from the conversations I'm already having with chief officers that they're planning a response to that from a policing point of view. For example, in the Tenby area, they've already initiated something that they refer to as Operation Lion. It's been embedded there for the last 5 years because of the influx of tourists. And that is to provide additional resources, additional visible policing patrols, having things like the visible police vans. We've got these little community hubs that can sit in a particular location, again, to provide safe spaces and to educate and to try and prevent nasty things happening ultimately. That is the whole purpose of those operations. In terms of the wider resourcing, so that is already in sort of being planned from a chief officer's point of view. This is quite an operational question. But then linked to that would be the returning of students in September as well. So that needs to, and it always is actually, in particular in Aberystwyth in the Dyfed-Powys area, it is an issue that we take seriously. We normally engage very early in the return, sort of late August into September, with the university to try and understand what some of the issues are. And key to that then is ensuring that we have police staff, officers, but also the volunteers, the special constabulary available to be brigaded and increasing the visible presence in the town centres such as Aberystwyth when the students return. So plans are in place is the reality. I'm predicting that this summer is going to be even busier than the last summer period that we had. So the force are already on sort of heightened alert for that in the force area. So plans are in place.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. We'll now move over to Philippa.
Thank you, and thank you for your question, Jess. So I think that communication is a key part of this, and that I know I asked my my teenage son, does he know what the rules are around COVID, for example, at the moment? Because I might watch television news, I'm on Facebook, but he's on Snapchat, and I'm not sure that we're necessarily getting the right messaging through to younger people, to students. And really, that feedback from you would be fantastic. As are you getting what the messages are about public safety, particularly around the pandemic? And if you're not getting them, what would be the best way to be in touch with you about things? But also a huge thank you to everyone who has acted responsibly, and a huge thank you to the police and those working with the police for going above and beyond. You know, they've got their usual roles to do, and they've had to police the pandemic as well, which has been incredible. A final one there, resources are always tight, but if local government, local councils can help with more bins, public loos available and everything like that, I think that would be a useful thing to have as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much there, Philippa. We'll now move over to Glyn.
Well, I suspect I've not got a huge amount else to say on the operational side of things. I think David and Philippa both covered it very, very well. This is about stuff like town centre CCTV to tackle antisocial behaviour, of course, and I'd congratulate David in rolling out those schemes across the Dyfed-Powys region. It's about a community policing approach and engaging with local businesses and the university and the Students' Union. The Welsh Liberal Democrats are committed to creating more PSCOs and police officers, and of course would like to engage with special constables and volunteers within the police service, to keep people safe, because it is going to be an incredibly busy summer. I think the only thing I could add from a distinctly Liberal position is that the Welsh Liberal Democrats and the Liberal Democrats across the UK are opposing any attempts to enforce vaccine passports for hospitality. Businesses don't want them, and it's going to adversely affect young people who might not have even been offered the vaccine. And after we've all spent so long, I'm a young person myself, I've had the past 2 years at university curtailed quite significantly, we've all tried so hard. We isolated for the whole of the lockdown period, and now the government is going to try and tell us that we can't go to the pub because we haven't had our vaccine yet and haven't been offered it. So we would oppose any measures like that they might be toying with. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Glyn. And last but not least, Stephen and Jonathan.
Thanks, Nate. I think it's an opportune moment to. I had the opportunity to pass on our thanks to the acting chief constable a couple of weeks back during a briefing I was privileged enough to be invited to. One has to bear in mind that on this particular subject of hospitality reopening, of the eye of the COVID storm, if you like, Dyfed-Powys Police have had the, in my view, entirely unique issue of policing an area that frankly is the favoured spot for the nation's domestic holidays. It is obviously that's not completely unique, because Cornwall could probably shout that, claim that mantle as well. But the other issue that they've had to contend with, and for which they have my deepest sympathies for, is that they have had to take dual instruction from their masters in the Home Office, and have also had to do whatever Mark Drakeford tells them he's decided he wants them to do. So they effectively had two bosses, and they have had the issue of having half the nation wanting to come along and visit during the last year. And I think the force has dealt with it incredibly well. And as I say, I pass those thanks on to the Chief Constable, because I think they've had a hell of a task on their hands. In terms of the moderate reopening of pubs and clubs, Jess's question, there is no easy answer, because I think the first thing you want to sympathise with Glyn, and indeed everybody watching on this channel, that the student experience has been completely and utterly decimated for the last year, and it must be dreadful. I really do sympathise with you. It's I had a hell of a lot of fun in my first 6 months at university, and I didn't have any restrictions on my pub activity. I probably should have done in hindsight. But I do sympathise. On the flip side, we obviously have the economic issue of lots of small businesses that are desperate to reopen and that really need your business. But at the same time, the epidemiological answer that at the moment someone has a couple of pints, the idea of social distancing does have a habit of going out the window. And that is just a matter of fact, unfortunately, which is a lot of the reason to give Mark Drakeford his due, and indeed Matt Hancock, that the reason they have had to close pubs in this regard is for that very purpose. I think, as has already been said, I think pretty much every candidate on the call is committing to an uplift in policing numbers. It's been a central part of my own party's priority since the 2019 general election, that across the UK, an additional 20,000 officers are recruited, and that Dyma will take a good share of those. But it is something that needs careful management. There's no question about that, both from the customer's point of view, the pubs, and indeed public safety angle.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Jonathan. David, if you want to jump in, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, just two things that I forgot to mention, actually, and I was prompted with John's comment in relation to the relationship with Welsh Government. So I think it would be wise and good of me, really, to congratulate Welsh Government on the liaison that they had with policing in Wales. So we had regular meetings. I was the chair of the Policing in Wales group at the time, which is the group of the 4 police commissioners and chief constables that sit. I was the chair when we went into the COVID period back in March of last year, and I would have regular meetings, phone conversations with the Deputy First Minister in Welsh Government. I was even invited to a cabinet meeting with Welsh Government to talk about the policing experiences. So I would say that actually the confusion of having 2 masters didn't play out in Wales. We had a really strong relationship with Welsh Government, and the devolved institutions of health and the health legislation was being explained and worked upon, and even listened to from a policing point of view when the regulations were pulled together. And the other point I forgot to mention as well is, in terms of the enforcement, there is a role here for local authorities. The licensing authority needs to come into play, and we've some fantastic partnership work with our 4 unitary authorities, with Dyfed Powys Police, to try and enforce where we have some establishments that are actually not abiding by the rules and the regulations. So as opposed to criminalising, for want of a better description, young people and issuing tickets, fixed penalty notices, it's important to take action and to give the premises themselves an opportunity to improve their standards of delivery linked to that. It's just a comment I forgot to mention, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. I just want to make sure no other candidate wants to jump in for an extra minute. No? Okay, brilliant. Okay, then we will move on to our final of our pre-submitted questions that were chosen for the evening. So this is from Jamie. And Jamie says, what plans do you have for dealing with anti-police protests and opinions? And for this, we will go over to Jonathan first.
Thank you, Nate. A topical one. I think the first thing to scotch, and I am going to predict that there may be a couple of people on the left-hand side of the political spectrum will start to shake their heads at this, but the new bill that has seemed to be at the centre of this, the Policing and Courts Bill, has, I believe, had a great deal of misrepresentation, deliberate misrepresentation in the press. It is currently before Parliament and it is being scrutinised, and I dare say various amendments will be placed for it. But in terms of its direct relationship to protests. It is designed to prevent the likes of Extinction Rebellion from being able to and free to barricade a free press, which is something I would hope all candidates on this meeting would agree with. It is also something that would prevent and make a crime for people to glue themselves to buses or to impede essential public infrastructure such as tube trains, obviously in London, or trains outside of. That is a public safety issue. That is not preventing the right of lawful protest. That is common sense, quite frankly. There has been a deliberate obfuscation from certain quarters to conflate the COVID regulations, which do prevent mass gatherings for wholly sensible reasons, I would hope everyone would agree, with that new legislation. The two are not in any way linked apart from circumstance and the current time frame. That bill does almost nothing to affect a lawful, peaceful protest. What it does is stop dangerous behaviour and attempts to prevent free speech. And that, I think, is an important point to get across. It also does a great number of other things, but that's not entirely relevant to the question. We have seen a number of quite unpleasant signs, particularly in Bristol of late. And again, talking to the acting chief constable recently, that Dyma Powys officers were seconded as part of the UK policing effort to go and help out over there. I'm delighted to say none of them were hurt in the process, but unfortunately, several officers were hurt. Now, the same bill does in fact enable the stiffening of sentences for assaults on emergency workers. I think that is entirely right. The difference between an emergency worker, particularly a police officer or a paramedic, is that they don't have the opportunity to walk away from trouble, which is why I strongly believe that the law should be there to protect them if they are assaulted in the course of their duty. That is entirely right, and it is legislation I wholeheartedly agree with. I think on that note, I will tie up there, as I'm probably going to get a time warning in a second. Thank you, Nate.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Yeah, you predicted the time warning very well there. We'll now move over to Glenn.
So I've got a number of things to say on this. One of which is that as a Liberal, I'm not in the kind of the game of policing people's opinions about the police. I would obviously, as a Police and Crime Commissioner, seek to defend the individual police officers, but where there are problems, I think they definitely need to be called out, and we need to be able to protect people. With regards to the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, which Jonathan just outlined, I suspect he might have been referring to me, being as I had already pointed out that I was opposed to the bill, because I fundamentally believe in our right to protest. And there are a few things that I like to mention about it, or one thing in particular, which is that the bill now increases penalties for the denigration of statues and war memorials. Now, whilst I might not favour denigrating war memorials or statues, I think that's a big slap in the face for all those people who are protesting about the horrible death of George Floyd and the Sarah Everard vigil. And I think that's a deliberate move by this Tory government to really stoke the fires of the so-called culture wars, which they have created. I think one further thing to say about the policing of the policing of protests is that I think, and anti-police sentiment, is that I think sometimes people have a right to be angry. And I think if you look at the photos on social media of how the vigil for Sarah Everard was policed, and compared it to the way in which people were allowed to go outside and mourn the death of Prince Philip, I think that was absolute travesty, and I think it's totally ridiculous. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. Thanks very much.
Nate,
Thank you very much, Glenn. Yeah, Jonathan, if you
sorry
want
to ask, but do you mind? I'll keep it brief. See, unfortunately, Glenn, and I totally agree with you on the right of peaceful protest. I think that is a central plank of our democracy and very important. God forbid it was ever messed with. But there is a real danger there with the flip you made from the danger, the denigration of statues, which can be debated in the House of Commons, straight to the Sarah Everard case. The two are not relevant. To bring in Sarah Everard's name to this debate, or that entire debate surrounding what happened to her, the policing of that was unfortunate. My job is not here to defend the behaviour of the Met Police, but to politically bring those two together, I'm afraid, is abhorrent to me, and I really don't think you should have done that. I'm sorry.
Can I respond to that, Nate?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Glenn.
Well, I apologise for any offence caused to you, Jonathan, and to anyone else on the call. My switch was unfortunate. I think the point I made about the way that the vigil was policed was incredibly unfortunate and ham-fisted. And I was simply responding to what you had said about the police crime and sentencing bill.
Apology accepted.
Thank you very much, both of you. Go back to the original question now. David, great to hear your opinion.
Yeah, so one thing I agree with John on is that there's a lot more in the bill than just what's been singled out as the majority of people have got an issue with. And I think the police covenant aspect of it, the sentencing of attacks on emergency service workers, I wholeheartedly agree with that element of it. The blunt instrument that is when you look at the detail of the legislation around protesting, I do have an issue with that. So when they quote serious annoyance, for example, as a term within the legislation, that does worry me on a personal level. And I think there is something in what Glyn said around the polarization of protesters and against the police. And I think we've seen that then being inflamed and borne out in the anti-police protesting, which I think is very, very unfortunate, because what it is actually is that people want to protest against the bill itself. And that's led on to other things. Now, where I'm going to disagree with John is in relation to the amendment in the House of Commons, because the current government have such a majority that just follow the whip throughout all of the debates and the discussions in Westminster. This has got no hope of being amended in the first instance going through the House of Commons. And for an individual that doesn't necessarily support the House of Lords, I'm actually holding out that the House of Lords will bring some element of sense to this debate and discussion for this particular element of the bill. Now, linked to that, and I think this is an important discussion to have, for me, this is a bill that has been cooked up in the Home Office in Westminster with a particular metropolitan view of life, in particular metropolitan view that is more pertinent to law in England, in my opinion. And this would, for me, lead to the discussions that we would be better served with legislation born out in Wales. We have a very deep-rooted history in non-conformist activity in Wales, lots of protests. Aberystwyth University itself, and the protest on Trefechan Bridge many years ago, I think in 1962, where the Welsh Language Society sat themselves on the bridge to protest in relation to parity in relation to the Welsh language. Those individuals, would they have been deemed to have caused a serious annoyance? Would they therefore be facing a court appearance with the potential of a 10-year sentence? These are serious issues that do need to be addressed. And I'm hoping that the politicians will do the right thing and seek to make those amendments that John mentioned, but I'm less confident due to the outweighted government at the moment that has that majority that will just railroad this through the House of Commons. So I'm against it, by the way, that element of the bill. I think I've made that clear, haven't I?
Thank you very much there, David. And last but not least, we'll go over to Philippa.
Thank you. Well, I think I started off speaking about the importance of human rights and our rights. And I think it's really important, and thank you, Jamie, for your question. It's really important to note that already in our law with the European Convention on Human Rights and international human rights law, not all rights are absolute. And in any case, when people rail against them, in fact, there are already limitations to at least some of our rights in law. And our Shadow Justice Secretary, David Lammy, had said about this bill that it's putting forward disproportionate controls on free expression and the right to protest, and I would agree with that. So one of the really important things in my mind at the moment with the government that is led in Westminster by Boris Johnson is really, as you may remember that as London Mayor, he bought a water cannon for crowd control, and actually it was then his predecessor, Theresa May, who banned their use. So I really wonder about a government led by Boris Johnson when it talks about bringing in this type of bill, what the ultimate goal is. And actually it is something I find extremely worrying for the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Philippa. And thank you very much to all of our candidates today. It's been really great to hear all of your opinions. This brings us to the end of our session today. Thanks again to all the candidates for attending and sharing your thoughts on important issues impacting our community. Thank you to everyone who has joined and those that submitted questions. It's great to see so many young people getting involved in this election. Don't forget that voting takes place on Thursday, the 6th of May. Make sure you get out and exercise your democratic right to choose who you want to represent you. To find out where to vote, keep an eye on our socials, as we'll be sharing details of how to find your polling station. Thank you, everyone.
Daw hynny ni at diwedd i'n sesiwn heddi. Diolch eto i'n holl ymgeiswyr am fynychu a rhannu eich meddyliau am y materion pwysig sy'n effeithio i'n cymuned. Diolch i bawb sydd wedi ymuno â ni a rhai o gyflwynodd cwestiynau. Mae'n wych gweld cymaint o bobl ifanc yn cymryd rhan yn yr etholiad hwn. Peidiwch ac anghofio bod pleidleisio'n digwydd dydd Iau 6 o Fai. Gwnewch yn siŵr eich bod chi'n mynd allan ac yn arfer eich hawl democrataidd i ddewis pwy rydych chi am eich cynrychioli chi. I ddaganfod ble i bleidleisio, cadwch lygad ar ein cyfryngau cymdeithasol gan y byddwn yn rhannu manylion am sut i ddod o hyd i'ch gorsaf pleidleisio lleol. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Diolch.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.